If you like what you watch, then don't forget to follow us on Facebook and Twitter for the latest updates on The More Show. Remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel for new weekly television and radio shows.
The comments and views expressed on The More Show are those of the people that make them and do not necessarily reflect the views of Kevin Moore, The More Show, or this radio station and its affiliates or sponsors.
Hello and welcome to another edition of The More Show, which is sponsored by the UFO Matrix magazine. I'm your host, Kevin Moore, and on today's show, I'm about to be joined with our guest, James Clarkson. James Clarkson is a career investigator who has successfully completed 20 years of ongoing and specialized training in the field of criminal investigations and police operations. As a young man, James heard a radio broadcast in 1966 about ufology, and thus began a lifelong quest to learn what is behind the mystery. In 1993, James Clarkson met June Crain and became both her friend and primary researcher into her past when she worked in classified laboratories at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base from 1943 to 1953. June Crain describes from experience what the scientists and engineers of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base knew about UFOs and how very different their common knowledge was from what the public is told. James Clarkson, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here tonight, Kevin.
It's an absolute honor to have you back on the show, James. It really is. So, James, how did you become a UFO investigator?
Well, it's sort of a double direction taken at the same time over most of my life now. I started off when I was about 12 years old. I got interested in UFOs, and I wish that I could tell you that it was because of a spectacular sighting or event, but it's mainly just intellectual curiosity, and it actually started with a particular radio interview when a famous author named John G. Fuller was being interviewed on KGO radio in San Francisco, California, and my parents were gone for the weekend, and I was home there by myself, and I had the radio on, and he was talking about incident at Exeter, about a series of UFO events in Exeter, New Hampshire, which have become very famous, and they involved police officers, multiple witness sightings of a particular type of craft that was always described the same way. And also in that story were the elements that we hear over and over again, which was official denial and deception, because one of the policemen was an Air Force veteran, and the Air Force said that he couldn't tell the difference between a disc that was down so low in the air above him that he dropped to one knee and started to draw his revolver. He didn't know the difference between that and high-altitude refueling of Air Force tanker craft. I mean, it's just such a ridiculous idea, but if the Air Force says it, we're all supposed to believe it. Well, that kind of got my mind moving, that there was something really wrong. There was a disconnect between what's officially said and what real people are reporting. You know, people who have very serious jobs, very good credentials, who are honest, decent people. And I started collecting books and articles, and it wasn't all the time. I mean, I was busy doing other things, and that's the other direction that I went in, is that I was always drawn to law enforcement. And I ended up going away from that and then coming back to it. And I enlisted in the Army, joined the military police. I was assigned to Fort Lewis, Washington, which is near Tacoma and Seattle in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. And when I got out, I became a police officer for a city on the coast of Washington named Aberdeen.
Okay. So with your police background then, would you say that's helped you to be a credible UFO researcher?
Absolutely. And the reason I would say that is that investigations, in my opinion, is a mindset. And once you learn how to investigate, you can investigate anything, because it's basically a matter of following the steps. In fact, if you even take the word investigate and go back to its Latin root, you'll find that it talks about following a trail, which is what you're really trying to do. And you're always asking yourself, when you do a criminal investigation, you do the same thing that I believe you should do with UFOs or with anything that you're investigating. There is this fictitious person who doesn't really exist, but they taught us to believe in this person and always question him, or I suppose it could be a her too. But it's the reasonable man or woman, the reasonable person. And this reasonable person is kind of like everybody. So whenever you take a step in an investigation, you ask yourself the question, what would a reasonable person believe if they were confronted with the same evidence and testimony that I have before me right now? What is the most reasonable conclusion? And of course, that's been described other ways, which, there's the parable about Occam's razor. In other words, if you're given 2 or 3 possible explanations, the simplest and the easiest one is the most likely one to be true. Now, of course, when you get into UFOs, the conclusions that you arrive at and how you get to a determination of what is most simple and most logical is based on what your assumptions are. So obviously, if you assume that it's not possible that we've ever been visited or contacted by non-human intelligence, then obviously you can never arrive at that conclusion. But if you're more of an open-minded person and you believe that it's not only extremely likely, but almost for sure has happened, which you and I spoke about briefly when you mentioned one of my heroes, Eric von Däniken. I think he was one of the first people who decided, let's take a fresh look at human history. Let's not look at it the same old way. And that's part of what being a good investigator is. And I know this not only based upon personal experience, but also because I was a supervisor. I've been a supervisor, a sergeant for police officers and for detectives. And the investigator who can look at things in another way will oftentimes make the breakthrough. You have to see it differently to get it. Because sometimes you can have the truth right in front of you and you just don't get it. And it takes somebody else coming in and looking at it with a fresh set of eyes and a new perspective who says, wait a minute, why isn't it like this? I think this all plays into my approach to UFOs. Now, obviously, most of the time when we get UFO reports, I would say the majority of them have conventional explanations. And there's nothing wrong with that. That proves that people are watching. People are making good observations. They just don't know how to interpret them.
That's right.
And so part of my job as a mutual UFO network investigator or a state director is to do public outreach to people and to explain to them what the process is and also help them to maybe learn a little bit about astronomy or some of the other things or weather that we take into consideration. So the better able you are to rule out the conventionally explained objects, you're more likely to recognize when you get a trufo or a true UFO. In other words, something that combines a high level of strangeness with high witness credibility. When you have those two things together, you have what I've heard the term, I didn't coin it, but I like it, trufo. You have a true UFO event because you have something that you can document, you can pin it down, you can record it and say, I may not ultimately know what this means, but it now is part of the history of the phenomena, and maybe someday it will be important. Maybe it will be explained one day. But right now we can't explain it.
Okay, well, tonight's show is going to be based around your work and research with the June Crain story. But before we get there, I think we have to just go quickly and briefly just back to Roswell, New Mexico. Now, in your opinion, very briefly, what happened in Roswell, New Mexico in 1947?
Well, going back to that particular weekend, you have to paint the scene briefly. Okay, Obviously, New Mexico is a state that has a lot of desert area in it. It is also the first place in the world that had permanently stationed nuclear weapon-armed bombers. The 509th Bombardment Battalion was stationed at Walker Army Air Field just south of Roswell, New Mexico, and they actually supplied the bombers that were used to drop atomic weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of World War II. The bombers came from Roswell, New Mexico. It appears that on that particular weekend, at least one, and possibly two, depending on which version of the initial story, unknown craft from some other place. I'm guessing because of their size, the way they've been described, I have a hard time imagining that these were interstellar craft. I'm thinking that they probably came from something that was orbiting the Earth, and now it appears, I recently bumped into an article which indicated that there has been some documented research. In fact, this was Stanton Friedman brought it up in one of his new books about a large craft being sighted over Alaska, and when I say large, I'm talking in the order of a mile or more. In other words, a mothership type craft. Well, in any event, one or two smaller craft crashed at Mac Brazel's ranch. Mac Brazel found a huge field of wreckage, brought some of it into town, gave it to the sheriff. The sheriff called the military base, and the base intelligence officer, Jesse Marcel Sr., and one of the other intelligence officers from the counterintelligence unit went with him. Wreckage was recovered. Jesse Marcel let his family see a box of the wreckage. A massive recovery effort was undertaken. I do subscribe to the idea that there were two crash sites, and the reason that I do that is because of, this gets kind of complicated, and I don't want to go too far because you could easily do two shows on just the Roswell crash.
Of course.
But the debris was recovered. There was an effort to deceive the public away from the primary crash site, where I do believe that non-human bodies were recovered. I believe that there were autopsies done right there at Walker Army Air Field. Orders came down from higher up. The wreckage and the bodies were taken away. And you got to bear in mind, this is a long holiday weekend. This is after the war. Eventually, when they began to realize this potential seriousness of this event, probably because the press all around the world, after the initial press release, which, by the way, is really interesting, this is the only time that I know of where the press actually came out and said that a flying saucer had been recovered. Walker Army Air Field captures flying disc. I believe it's Roswell Army Air Field. The abbreviation in the letters captures flying disc. That hit the wire services. There were newspapers all over the earth that were calling Roswell, New Mexico. Well, when they realized how much excitement was being generated, they put the lid on it. They came up with a cover story. They said, oh no, this base intelligence officer couldn't tell the difference. You know, he made a mistake. It's just a crashed weather balloon. And of course, there's all the cover-up, deception, years of lying, witness intimidation, everything else. Well, that wreckage ultimately ended up, much of it I'm sure, ended up in Dayton, Ohio, hidden away by the Air Force. And that, of course, would lead into the June Crain story in kind of a backhanded way.
That's right.
Because it ended up at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, which is where she worked between 1943 and 1953. And so that's how I ended up getting a piece of this puzzle kind of another way.
So let's take this story forward now, and let's go to the point where you met June Crain. Let's go to 1993. Tell me what happened then.
Well, as I explained, in 1986, I joined the Mutual UFO Network. Well, I decided on my own, through a variety of circumstances that it would be a good idea for me to get out there and start meeting the public. So I put together a slide presentation, lecture notes, etc., and I started going to all the libraries. And my wife, Joanne, used to be a children's librarian for the Timberland Regional Library System that covers most of southwest Washington State, and there's like 24 libraries. Where I was a police officer was in the city of Aberdeen, which is at the mouth of the Chehalis River and the Wishkah River, and it empties into Gray's Harbor. And if you go to the north end of the harbor, 25 miles in one direction, you end up in Ocean Shores, Washington. And if you go 25 miles in the other direction, you end up in Westport, Washington. And interestingly enough, I ended up getting the June Crain story because I went and gave a lecture at the Ocean Shores Library, and I would just say parenthetically without getting involved in it, but just as an odd coincidence, I went to Westport, Washington, and eventually ended up investigating a UFO crash retrieval event. But that's a subject, if we get off on that, we're going to get misdirected. But in 1993, I gave a lecture at the Ocean Shores Library, and there were probably 40-some-odd people there. And I gave the whole program, and when I was done, this very determined-looking, nicely dressed older woman, she was about 70 years old, approached me and she said, "You're right. The government knows all about UFOs and they're keeping it a secret." And I said, "Well, how do you know?" And she said, "Because I worked there." And I said, "Well, can you tell me more?" And she said, "No, they'll come and arrest me." And she had kind of an odd look in her eye. And I suspect that that was partially because I didn't make it a secret that at that particular time I was the detective sergeant for the Aberdeen Police Department. And I was, a regular bona fide law enforcement officer. And I think she was maybe afraid that I would arrest her. But I gave her my business card, and I said, "Please, if you ever change your mind, will you call me? I'd love to hear from you." And I really didn't hear from her for 4 years.
That's right.
It wasn't until 1997.
That's right. It was 1997. Now, what changed her mind in 1997? What reversed her to sort of talk to you in the end?
Well, oddly enough, much as we bemoan the way that the media treats UFOs, every once in a while they do us a favor. And in this particular case, they did me a huge favor. Because 1997, long about as we got towards the end of the month of June, we're coming up on the 50th anniversary of the Roswell Crash, because it was the July 4th weekend of 1947. And it was obvious that there was going to be a lot of attention focused on Roswell. I mean, suddenly there were more books and more articles, and there was going to be a huge gathering of people who were interested in this in Roswell, New Mexico. As I recall, it was destined to be so large that they hired off-duty police officers from all over the state just to do traffic control that weekend. And Roswell is not that big of a city. So there was I think some real concern that, the one thing they don't want to have happen, and when I say they, I'm talking about a, select group of whoever it is who forms the policy, the kind of black budget, shadowy folk. They did not want the public to get behind any particular UFO-related subject, so they had to make it go away. So this is when the Air Force came out with a book called Roswell Case Closed. And they said, yes, we really didn't tell you the truth because we had this very classified weather balloon project where we took a whole bunch of balloons and strung them together, and we put a microphone on it, and we were going to float it over Russia and see if we could hear when they tested a nuclear weapon. And that was Project Mogul. And we couldn't tell you about it at the time because it was so secret. They never did exactly explain how it was that a base intelligence officer couldn't, tell that this was a balloon or a series of balloons that had crashed. They didn't explain that or bother to. And they said, oh, by the way, we dropped these dummies from high altitude, and They just happened to look like GIs, and obviously somebody must have seen one of them lying in the desert, and that's where all the stories of alien bodies came from, and you all ought to just pack it up and go home. And that, of course, was the message that CNN News Network was saying over and over again, hey, look, the Air Force has finally come clean on Roswell. Don't look at the man behind the curtain, in effect. There's no deeper truth here. There's nothing you need to study. And please, God forbid, don't all of you go down to Roswell and start thinking that you can change policy. Well, June heard all of this news coverage, and out of the blue my phone rang, and it was her. And the first thing she said was, "It's a damn lie." And I said, "Well, June, good to hear from you." And she says, "Have you been watching the news?" Well, I had, and we started talking. And she started telling me, that she had worked there and that she had seen things and heard things, and they were lying, and they had lied before, and they had always used the balloon story. And I said, "Well, why are you willing to talk to me now, and you weren't willing to talk to me then?" And she said, "I'm 72 years old. I've outlived 2 husbands. My cancer's in remission. What are they going to do? Shoot me or put me in prison? I can do either one." And I'm no fool when it comes to a cooperative witness, so I asked her how soon I could be at her house. So I packed up my little case and my tape recorder and my yellow pad and a bunch of pens, and I started going to visit June. And first we became friends. You don't push a person like that. You let them tell you in their own good time. Well, first they have to decide that they're going to trust you, because nobody will tell you anything if they don't think that you care about what they have to say or that you're trustworthy. Those are 2 basic rules of all interviewing for investigations. And June and I became friends above and beyond that because she was a remarkable person. And as I got to understand her life and the way she had lived it, I started to have a lot of respect for her. Well, she gave me probably about 1.5 inches of documents. And she said she used to have more, but like most of us over the years, you can't keep everything. But they showed exactly what her job assignments were. They proved that she worked at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. They proved that she worked in laboratories. She knew all kinds of names. She knew names of projects that at the time she told them to me, you couldn't find any information on them. There was nothing available. Like she talked about Project Caucasian and how she only got to work on a tiny part of it, but it was so sensitive that every time it got brought up, her boss would act really, really nervous. Well, after June passed away, and after I started researching what she had told me, I couldn't find anything on Project Caucasian. But then several years later, it was declassified. It turned out to be the code name for the engineering project to build a parachute harness for dropping a hydrogen bomb out of the belly of a bomber. So, I mean, all of these details that she gave me were corroborated. And she told me some very remarkable things that relate directly to the entire UFO mystery and to the unfortunate position that, the government in the United States has taken, and I guess they are stuck with now because they don't know how to quit telling this same old story.
Okay, so this base, this Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, it's not just an Air Force base, it's also a research facility, is that right?
That's correct. It's home to 2 of the key divisions in the Air Force. It's probably the heart of the Air Force in many ways. Originally, it was called Wright Field. Patterson Air Force Base started nearby. After 1947, you got to bear in mind that prior to 1947, there was no United States Air Force. It was the Army Air Corps. Well, eventually, after there was an Air Force, it also became home to something that used to be called the Foreign Technology Division. And of course, those of us who love the subject of UFOs always smile a little bit when we hear the word foreign technology. because we think that there's a little double entendre in the way they named that place. But they would tell you that it was designed for any sort of recovered enemy aircraft. In other words, if we captured a MiG or something being flown by the Chinese or whatever, it would be very carefully handled, and it would be taken to the Foreign Technology Division, and they would retro-engineer it. Well, a lot of people think that one of the first things that they got to retro-engineer, or at least attempt to retro-engineer, is whatever it was that crashed at Roswell. And so Wright-Patterson has always been at the heart of the Air Force, and it remains so today. There's the Air Materiel Command, and there's the Air Intelligence Division. They are both headquartered there.
Right.
They are key parts of the United States Air Force. There's no controversy about that. That's historical fact.
Right, so very briefly, what was June's job at the Air Force Base, just briefly?
In today's world, we'd call her an office manager. Back then, all she could be was a secretary clerk. But when I heard all of the responsibilities that she was given, today we would call her an office manager.
And she
in other words...
Go ahead.
When part of her job, of course, was dictation, making sure that everybody had the documents, reports, etc., that they needed. But you got to bear in mind, this is long before there were any such things as computers. But there was a system of security clearance and access. You had to have the right security clearance, and you had to have a need to know. She told me how she was in charge of a dozen safes, and her job was to log in and out top secret information and make sure that it only went to the right people, and that at the end of the day, everything was resecured and locked up. And that even included, and I guess now I'm dating myself, but I do remember writing things on a typewriter. And they took the actual typewriter ribbon out of every typewriter and secured it in a safe at night, because their fear was that an enemy agent who got a hold of the typewriter ribbon might be able to figure out what had been typed. That's how careful they were about security. Everything that could be compromised was kept secret and concealed and hidden away and locked up at night. And her job was giving out that information and then resecuring it.
So this was one of the top military bases at the time, and still is, and security for her to just get into work must have been pretty tough as well.
Exactly. In other words, this is a secure facility inside of a secure facility. You have to have clearance to get on the base, and then to get into a laboratory, you have to have the right clearance.
Okay, and she held a secret and top secret, what was classed as Q clearance, I believe, that allowed her access.
She claimed that she had a Q clearance. I have not been able to document that, but I learned over time that a Q clearance was originally issued by the Atomic Energy Commission because it related specifically to all things nuclear in the United States. So the records of her clearance probably are not with the Personnel Records Center in St. Louis, which is where I eventually got a complete copy of her personnel file.
Tell me about the Master Sergeant and what he told June Crain over a coffee break.
Well, this is kind of interesting, and it is important to set the stage. She talked to me about someone she referred to as Master Sergeant Clarence, and she told me over and over that she couldn't remember his name, his last name. She even gave me a picture of his wedding. And it's kind of cute because she claimed that she didn't mind being tape recorded. But when I tape recorded her, she kept trying to hand me this written letter, which I still have, where she had written down all the details. And I kept trying to prompt her to put it all out on the tape. So we had talked about these key incidents before, and the context of the Master Sergeant Clarence story is this occurred in a break room inside of a secure facility. And she knew a lot of the pilots, and she knew this Master Sergeant. And he came in one morning, and he was upset, and he started talking about a crash. And since a lot of these people knew each other, June and her friends wanted to know, if anyone had been killed. And of course, they were thinking that he was talking about the crash of a military aircraft. And he had to correct them and say, no, that's not what we're talking about. It was a spaceship. It was, the people on board weren't human. And so that's the context of that particular section of the tape.
Okay, well, let's just quickly play that clip back now, and let's hear what she had to say.
Until she lands. And now, the sergeant, his first name's Clarence, Master Sergeant. His first name's Clarence. I went to their wedding. I sent the picture of the wedding to Randall. I still can't remember that man's last name.
Okay.
But he was in charge of that airplane. And when he came to there...
What kind of an airplane?
Well, it was our regular transport.
A military transport?
Yeah.
And what was it that he said?
It came in from New Mexico. He said, what I brought in this morning, it's in here.
Okay.
I want you to read this.
I will.
And he said that he brought two little men in.
Okay, when two little men...
He called them little green men. Then he described them as a greenish blue. And they were 4 foot tall, and they were dead.
So the color could have been because they were dead.
Yeah. But see, it could have been any...
And we're talking about non-humans.
The non-humans, right.
Did he say anything else about them?
No, not really. Because it was only a matter of 15 minutes. We were having our coffee that morning. And so when Clarence hit the deck, he told us about this. That was his news for the day.
Is this one of those things where he's kind of like, maybe, I'm trying to guess here, but were there like maybe other ladies there and he's sort of like showing off or telling... No, he wasn't showing off.
No. These guys don't show off. I mean...
This is a serious man telling a story that...
When I'm saying engineers are sort of wacky, there's one thing they're not. It's not a wackiness like you'd think just being acting like a fool. It's just... it's hard to explain. But they're very serious. And they don't tell lies, they don't have jokes, they don't do anything like that. And so when they say something, they know they better be the truth. You just don't lie. You get your head knocked off.
Was this Master Sergeant, do you think, breaking security by talking about this?
No, because we were all secure.
Okay.
See, when you have security like that, you can't even take your husband to a party. We all had, if we had our Christmas party, we went and there was a guard at the door, and nobody but the people in the branch are the only ones that's there. You can't bring your husband or your wife. And when you're at home, you can't talk about your job because you got that in your head. You got security and you're cleared, and you keep your damn mouth shut. That's all there is to it. And it's a big burden because there's times that you'd like to talk about your job, but you can't.
Okay, well, we've just heard that clip there. Now, can you elaborate a bit on the audio clip we just heard?
Well, the outcome of that, of course, is that this would prove another way she is corroborating what a lot of UFO researchers have already concluded, that much of the wreckage was ultimately taken to Wright-Patterson, and that based upon descriptions that I've heard, some of it is still stored there to this day. And this, of course, fits into a whole other side of the story, which is that it also happens to be headquartered in Ohio, interestingly enough, is the Motel Corporation, who was commissioned in 1947. They were told by the military under contract that they should figure out how to manufacture something called memory metal. And that, of course, fits into still another part of the June story. And interestingly enough, at the time that I interviewed June, there had been no publicity about memory metal other than a few references, but no one talked about Battelle Corporation. No one talked about it being manufactured by our own government. Or in other words, I should make the distinction that it was what we have as memory metal. The researcher indicates that it was copied from, or they attempted to copy, part of what was found at Roswell as wreckage was this very odd metal, which we've come to call memory metal. And some people have referred to it as the holy grail of ufology, because any of us would give just about anything to get a piece of the spaceship in our hands. And that, of course, June claims that under another set of circumstances while she worked there, she actually got to handle some of it.
And we'll come to that clip just in a second. Just one more thing I want to go over the previous clip we just heard, which was the sort of description of the little green men that she spoke about.
Well, Master Sergeant Clarence pointed out that they were child-sized and that they were an odd color, that they were kind of a grayish green, and that eventually they were stored in a place that June told me was so secure that she had no reason to be in there, but she heard that that was where they were kept, was a place called the Aero Med Lab.
Right, okay. And this Aero Med Lab is another secure facility which she wouldn't have had any access to. It would have been a need to know, is that right?
Exactly. She had no reason to be in there.
Okay.
And she described how you didn't talk very much about this kind of thing. In other words, you were very careful what you said and who you were talking to. She even described to me how if you went to a party and it was an office party, you couldn't bring your spouse, for instance, because they didn't have the clearance.
So most of these conversations sort of took place over, would you say, coffee breaks, where they could, I guess, discuss, very classified stories, but they could discuss them with each other because they had the clearance.
Exactly. In other words, my understanding from her, it's just like working in an office environment now. You get to know people in your office, certain people you trust. You talk about things related to your job that you may not discuss with anybody else necessarily. And obviously, they're even more conscious of it in this kind of an environment because they are under security. They had training. They had all signed non-disclosure agreements saying if they had revealed something inappropriately, they could be criminally prosecuted.
So let's just go back to the memory metal that we were just discussing there. Let's just quickly listen to this clip regarding what June had to say about the memory metal.
Now, is this the same period of time I remember that you mentioned before that someone actually showed you a piece of something?
Yeah.
Was this during the same period of time?
Yes, 51, 52.
Okay, now who showed it to you?
Okay, it was Lieutenant Rose is the one that showed it to me, or Captain Wheeler. Now, it could have been one or the other of those guys because they were both in personnel shoots. And he walked in, and they always like to rag me because they couldn't figure me out. And he threw it on my desk, and it was a piece. Well, it was a piece that's about this big, and it was
about half of about size of a business card.
Yeah, about that size, and a half of this.
Okay.
There, and it was bent like this. And he says, "June, you're a good wrecker. Tear that thing apart. Break that up." And I took it and I bent it and I twisted it. And I laid it back down, and it got right back to the same shape. I got on my desk. He says, cut it, try cutting it. I got on my desk, I got my scissors out, and I snipped at it, and there was no way I could even cut that piece of metal. And it was as light as a feather. I had it in my hand, and I would say that it didn't weigh as much as these two cards. It wasn't that heavy. It was so light but strong, and it was about, the thickness would be about, say, let's see, it would be about that thick.
So it's fairly thick, but it doesn't weigh anything.
But it had no weight at all. It was like a feather. And so strong, it was sort of a grayish gunmetal type of color. And you could see that on the inside there was there was a coating on the outside. Both sides of it was the same. And the inside seemed to have a sort of a lead-colored a light lead-colored center to it.
What were the edges of this like? Were they even, or was it like part of something else?
It was even.
It was
all
even.
even. And I said, "What is it?" He said, "It's a piece of spaceship." When I, got through with it, and I couldn't do nothing with it, I said, "Well, what is it?" And he says, "Piece of a spaceship." He said, "I just come back from New Mexico, and I brought it with me." See, he had no business having it in the first place, but he...
So he was breaking security.
Yes, he was. Definitely.
Obviously, in 40 years, and even in my lifetime, being 45, I've seen improvements and changes in materials and plastic and metal. And have you ever? Is it like anything you've seen since?
I always look at things, metal things, and stuff like that, and I still have that curiosity because it still bothers me, and I have yet to see anything that would have those properties and look like that, and so light.
Okay, so when she's discussing the memory metal there, I mean, how thick was this piece of metal? I mean, how big was it that she held?
Well, when we were talking about it, I held up some business cards because she said that they were about that size, and we're talking about if you put three of them together, that's about how thick it was. And yet she kept remarking over and over again that it was light as a feather. And I deliberately tried to, I guess, poke her, for want of a better description, by kind of doubting her and saying, well, you've seen many things in the last 40, 50 years. And she immediately came right back at me and said, no, this metal is different than any metal that she has ever handled. It has extraordinary properties. It's extremely strong. It's extremely light. And if you wad it up into a ball, it returns to its original shape with no wrinkles and no evidence that you've done anything to it. So hence the term memory metal, because it goes back to the way it's like it knows what its original shape is.
Incredible, incredible. And again, she couldn't go back home and talk with the family about, these events and what she had seen. Again, this was, a very sort of solitary experience, wasn't it, to put it as such?
Yes, and even more so, and that's part of the dynamic that made me admire June so much. There was another anecdote that she told me about, and this one I have never been able to resolve this controversy, and in fact it only created another mystery. She insisted that she had been asked to take dictation from Dr. Werner von Braun, and this dictation was about why the United States needed a rocketry program. She states that she was taken by an armed guard, a high-ranking officer, to meet this man, and she was required to take dictation in a room with him, and that he had very cold eyes. He used a lot of technical language, a heavy German accent, and she couldn't go home until the report was perfect. And this officer told her, obviously as a way of making her feel good about what she was doing, but this really stuck in June's mind, that June, if we get this money, that when this report is given to Congress, if we get the appropriation, you will have had your moment in history. That was the way she described it. And every time June told me this story, she started crying. And I realized over time what that was about. Eventually, she left her job because she was a young wife. Her husband was getting out of the military. They had a baby, and she said that they begged her to stay. They wanted her to keep going. They wanted her to work for the fledgling space program, doing what she had been doing, but her husband made her leave. And she decided to go with her husband, and they moved to Portland, Oregon. She always felt bad about that because she was so proud of the work she did. And this, of course, was her conflict. Like so many of these witnesses, she did not want to break her security oath. She did not want to tell what she knew about the UFO question, but she reached a point in her life where she felt that it was more important to make a statement than it was to keep silent about something so important. Yeah. And that really drove it home to me what these witnesses go through before they decide to disclose, before they leak vital information. This is not an easy thing for these whistleblowers to do, and I guess that almost makes, in that respect, it gave me an insight that I'm using right now when I'm studying, the WikiLeaks phenomena and trying to understand all of that. But I learned firsthand talking to June. But anyway, she talked about Dr. Wernher von Braun. She talked about this interview repeatedly, and yet there is no historical reference to Wernher von Braun ever being at Wright Field or Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And interestingly enough, it was June who pointed that out to me. She said, I've studied the books, and he's not in there. And I've studied the books personally since then, and she's right. He's not in there for being at Wright-Patterson. I eventually contacted someone who was with Dr. von Braun right before he passed away. And I started communicating with her, this lady. And oddly enough, when I got into the key areas about was he ever at Wright-Patterson, etc., she all at once, for no reason that I know, broke off communication with me and would not respond anymore. And I don't know what that means. It's just one of those mysteries.
And again, like you say, having to disclose like she did and, keep onto these life-changing kind of secrets, she was under tight scrutiny, really, because there was this sort of what's classed as a too-hot memo that went round at the time, there was a chat going on in the office, I suppose. What is a too-hot memo?
That was what happened the same day that Master Sergeant Clarence disclosed the fact that he had just returned from New Mexico with bodies and pieces of a spaceship. And later on that morning, this courier came around from the base commanding officer, and he had what they called a too-hot memo. And what this meant was you had to stop what you were doing immediately, read the memo, and sign it. And the memo said that some irresponsible person had been discussing flying saucers and little green men, and that if this discussion did not cease immediately, people would be criminally prosecuted. Now, of course, this raises a whole bunch of questions, because why would the base commanding officer care about what should just be idle office gossip, since we all know that none of this stuff is real? And then, of course, the next question is, how did the base commanding officer know so quickly that this had even been discussed that morning?
That's right.
So there's a lot of questions that come out of this. But that's the kind of security that she lived in. I have a copy of her non-disclosure agreement, and it said that if she disclosed anything that she saw or heard while she was there, that she could be fined $10,000 and sent to prison for 20 years. Now, you got to bear in mind that $10,000 back then was an awful lot of money.
Of course it was. And obviously she was there between this period. I mean, did any other sort of UFO sightings come across her desk in that period when she was working there as well?
She stated that she was tasked periodically to write letters to people who reported UFOs. In other words, she ended up assisting with Project Blue Book that was also headquartered there. And Project Blue Book, of course, ended in, I believe, 1969, or I believe it's 69. After that time, the Air Force claimed that it no longer investigated UFOs, which, of course, we all know is not true. They just quit investigating UFOs publicly. But she would help write these form letters to people telling them, what you saw is not aerodynamically possible. We believe you saw, swamp gas, a weather balloon, whatever, just anything to make people go away. In other words, they tried to give them some kind of an answer, but they didn't really care what the answer was, as long as it wasn't extraterrestrial spacecraft.
Right, okay. Well, let's just quickly play a clip that you've sent us called the White Sands clip. So let's just roll that now.
Publicly one thing, and they would do something else.
Right. And this is this was a cover-up. When this report in newspapers said, how could such a conspiracy exist, that's how it existed. Because it was right at the very start of it. Project Blue Book was not formed to investigate those things. It was formed to stop the people from thinking that's what it was. That's my opinion, and I'll stick with it.
And somebody else was actually investigating.
Right. They were being investigated by the Project Blue Book officers, yes. But the basic thing and the reason why they was told the people were investigating it and everything, they were investigating it all right, very, very religiously. But at the same time, they were telling people they were nuts or drunk or dreaming or under drugs or something. And that's what Project Blue Book was all about. It was to try to squelch all talk of UFOs.
And if I remember right, too, in the letter you mentioned that people in this group went to White Sands to do testing and then came back.
Yes.
And did they say that anything unusual had happened to them?
Well, they said they were just as thick as fleas up there. They'd sit at night, they'd sit on the outside of their motels where they would stand or the buildings, and they would just watch them go over all types and shapes. There'd be motherships, big ones with little ones coming out of it, and then they'd see them return, and they had different colored lights. Some had orange, sometimes red, yellow, different lights they would see. And then what they would do, if the people, the engineers and scientists would report it that they saw them, they locked them up in a motel for 24 hours with no access to no radios, no people, no nothing, and they'd bring the meals into them, but have no contact with anybody, and they had them to write up what they saw, and then when they come out the following day, 24 hours later, they'd have them write it up again. And like the engineer said, to hell with it, I'm not going to report anymore. I'm not going to be locked up for 24 hours.
Okay, so that was the White Sands clip there. Again, you know, in pretty incredible stuff. I mean, how can you prove anything she says except why would someone her age make these things up?
Exactly. What did she stand to gain? It wasn't, you know, she didn't want money. She wasn't trying to be famous or anything else. She had this need to tell somebody what had happened to her, what she had experienced, because she thought that this was a very important subject and that it fit into a larger issue. The part that fascinated me about that particular clip was her description of how they would get the information from the witnesses, the scientists and engineers who went to the Southwest to experiment on early rockets. They felt that they were almost under surveillance by UFOs, and so they would get it both ways. The authorities would have it both ways. They would get the information in detail repeated to them, and at the same time, they made the experience so onerous that these people were not likely to report anything again or to really talk about it because they didn't want to be locked up for 24 hours and deprived of contact with other people. In other words, nobody wants to be detained and made to tell the same story over and over again. So pretty soon, the smart play is to just not report anything.
And again, it was June's wish for you to disclose this, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
Yeah. I mean, you've been able to back up all the events, the background to at least June's stories. But I suppose it's very hard to verify the key events. I suppose you could say that you have been part of this disclosure then, really. I mean, you've had this vehicle to do this. I mean, would you say that you would class yourself as a sort of, WikiLeaks disclosure?
Well, in my own way, yes. I think that if I had, for instance, if June had given me a piece of the memory metal, I would have had to have handled this way differently. I've had people ask me before, well, have you ever been threatened? Has anyone bothered you because you have talked about this? And the answer is no, because I don't think they're going to bother anybody. In other words, they're going to weigh their options. If you have something that they need to make go away, they will do whatever it takes to make you stop. And, how extreme that might be, heaven only knows. If you can't ultimately prove what you've got, then you're just another UFO. You know, you can be dismissed as a freak, a hobbyist, a believer, or, you know, all the other epithets that they throw at people who are seriously interested in UFOs. So yes, I'm part of the disclosure process. I'm proud of it. I'm an advocate. I know June was telling me the truth. Because of the June story, I got to spend the better part of an hour with Glenn Dennis with the door closed over a couple cups of coffee. And he told me his experience having worked at the Ballard Funeral Home in Roswell on the July 4th weekend as a young man, and getting the phone call where they said, how many child-sized coffins do you have in stock? Well, that fits right into what June told me, and I'm convinced. I was a policeman for a long time. Can I ultimately know for certain who's telling the truth and who isn't? No, I'm not a human lie detector. I'm sure people have fooled me. But I have a pretty good idea of, I think, who genuinely believes what they're telling me, who is sincere and who's credible. June was completely credible. Glenn Dennis was completely credible. I even know why Glenn Dennis never gave the real name of the nurse. I mean, that's another whole interesting story. But I have met so many people in the process of telling the June story that have made me more of an advocate for disclosure. This has deepened my understanding and my commitment to this field. It's grown more, not less, because I've gotten to meet a lot of the key researchers in this field, and the things that they've revealed to me have reinforced what June told me, and what June has told me reinforces what they've learned from their independent research. So it's what you call corroborating information. It locks together like pieces of a puzzle. You can't see the whole picture with one or two pieces, but when you put all of the pieces together, you see it, and you get it, and you know that it's real. So that's, I guess, how it all fits together for me.
Now, we're getting very close to the end of the interview here now, so you do have a book regarding the June Crain investigations, don't you?
Yes, I do.
And is that available from your website?
It is. I haven't found a really good way to market it. I don't pretend to be a webmaster by any stretch of the imagination. I do have, my website is ClarksonUFO.com, Clarkson, UFO.com, and I would be happy to mail a copy to anyone anywhere if they're willing to pay the equivalent of $14.95 and reasonable shipping. I will be happy to send them a book.
Okay, well, we'll put a link on our website for your book, and also if there's an Amazon link, we'll put a link on our website as well for that.
I don't have one. They charge too much, to be honest. They're not good to small authors.
Right. Okay. Well, we'll just keep the link then on your website that you've just mentioned there. Okay. Well, James, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us today. And if there's any closing comment you'd like to make, please go ahead.
Just simply, I think it's really imperative that people look for any news story or any event that they see going on around them that would kind of feed into this whole idea that we're being prepared for some sort of shift in consciousness and a higher awareness. And we're getting stories all the time about water being found all over the solar system, out in space. There's more Earth-like planets than we ever thought. I think it's only going to be a short step until they admit that life may exist everywhere. And I think we all need to be ready for the day when we greet our visitors, and when they're somehow open to us. And it will be when we are ready, when we're mature enough. So I guess what I'm asking people to do is start thinking that way, and we can make it happen.
James Clarkson, thank you so much for joining us.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
To find out more information on our guests, visit clarksonufo.com or visit my site themoreshow.co.uk and look up James Clarkson under past guests. Well, until next time, be safe.
If you like what you watch, then don't forget to follow us on Facebook and Twitter for the latest updates on The More Show. Remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel for new weekly television and radio shows.